This week is about holding space for the death of a language. And like we're literally mourning the way we used to make sense of our emotions. And that space, right? The room where we sit and we contemplate our grief is actually that Piscean space. This there's so much that's possible. There's so much possibility and beauty and wisdom and connection to God that is holding that grief that ultimately just wants us to become bigger. Hey, welcome to June 8th to June 14th. I'm going to jump straight in today and actually talk about journaling. It's Gemini season after all. Mercury in Cancer is ruling Gemini season, and Mercury in Cancer is very much emotional, very much about emotional processing. I've been doing a lot of that on my channel the last few weeks. If you've been here, hello. Thank you for being around. Thank you for your comments. It was so lovely. Everything's been so lovely. Honestly, I really appreciate everyone's feedback. If you're new, hello, welcome. I am a Cancer Sun and a Cancer Mercury, and so here we are. But here's what I want to say. Journaling in particular used to be a huge part of my life, and now it's not. And I realized this because I was craving recently to feel like I could vomit my emotions in kind of the same way as I used to, but I just can't. There's really nothing coming out, and nothing is feeling right, or dare I even say worthy of putting pen to paper. I know that doesn't sound great, but let me go on and hopefully it makes sense. It actually just feels like I've changed in what is worth processing to me, which means that my emotions have also changed. How I am orienting to my emotions has changed. And I see that also in just how I even verbally communicate with others, how I share my emotions with others. And if I compare the past to the present, I could feel stunted because I feel like I don't have that writing outlet anymore. But I'm actually realizing that I'm not stunted because I don't need the outlet anymore. It's a habit that I'm just no longer using. And there's a few reasons in my personal life that I could correlate this to healthier relationships being one of the biggest ones, for example. But the reality is that all of our minds are changing so dramatically with increased technology, and also obviously in the reflection of astrology I'm going to talk about today. But I think now more than ever, we are using our words to create worlds. And I think that's always been happening. But what's happening now, which is different, is that the world we're creating is really ours. It's really immediate, and we have to take ownership and responsibility for that world that our words are creating in a way that it was a little bit diffuse even last year. So there's many ways that I'm going to link this into the astrology this week, but the biggest signature is that Monday is beginning with a last quarter square between the sun and the moon. And I always interpret this lunar phase as a time to hold space. So this week, we are holding space for the moon, which will be in Pisces, mystical Pisces, the truth, the unknowable truth. And it's that moon that's going to dissolve what we think emotional processing is, with the sun in Gemini, ruled by Mercury in Cancer, as I mentioned. The fun thing is that by Sunday, we get the Gemini new moon, which is a brand new start in the way that we do the very same thing, emotionally process. So between Monday and Sunday is kind of this void space, an in-between, where we're ending one thing before starting another. And don't get me wrong, we have really lovely astrology in between this last quarter square and the new moon. mostly Venus conjuncting Jupiter in Cancer, and I would also say Venus moving into Leo. But still, the majority of this week, we are here to hold space for the dissolving of language. I think I could say that as the most general way to put it. And so I wonder if something has been similarly coming up for you, in that you don't want to emotionally process in the same way that you used to. So I'm going to keep talking about how I've been feeling, obviously, but I want to say more about this Pisces stuff, which is inspiration, and ruled by Neptune and Aries. It really is the personal highest truth. And again, that personal truth of who we know ourselves to be right here, right now, is holding space through that last quarter square for processing an emotional language that is probably dead. So we're processing rather the death of one way that we have emotionally processed our life in the past, right? Which again is this Sun in Gemini ruled by Mercury in Cancer. So that's really the last quarter square on Monday, the 8th. And I don't know why it's just been so strong for me coming out. As I said, new relationships, new emotional experiences, and I feel like I want to write about them, to process them so that I can keep moving my life forward. But I'm so used to circularly telling myself stories about what's going on, and I no longer am interested in actually circularly telling stories. And so this has changed the way that I write and that I reflect. On Tuesday, we're having both the Venus-Jupiter conjunction and a Mercury-Saturn square. So this Mercury-Saturn square, of course, is another aspect which is asking us to really kick the door down and say, hey, this is really what I think. Even though it's new, it's a little vulnerable to say this. But in general, having both of these aspects happening on the same day, this is a context that makes our voices heard. Like, we have to make our voices heard for the emotional wisdom that each of us carries with that Venus-Jupiter conjunction. And the interesting thing about this, from my perspective, is that this day, Tuesday, is really beginning what I'm calling a research project into our emotions. And that research project really kicks off later, like next week. Mercury enters shadow in Cancer, and then I think in 2 weeks or a couple weeks it'll go retrograde, and that retrograde period will really be what I think is going to be a very beautiful, emotional, artistic research project that combines all of the work we've been doing, Jupiter in Cancer, with our emotional intelligence and with our love for our family, our love for the process of human growth, for the evolution of human instinct and human wisdom. And I think that human part is so important. And I think that the emotionality of life is where we're feeling that humanity so clearly. It's not just some abstract question of are we AI or are we not? It's like, no, we have clear personal lives and clear emotions that we are living with, right? So there's a very big change that's going on in our minds this week that's actually so much bigger than just stopping journaling and starting a new way of journaling, for example. But it is the complete change of our minds that is reflected in the Uranus squaring the nodal axis. And that perfects on Thursday. So we've been building up to it. And I think that's why this idea has been coming to my brain so much more strongly than maybe just these interplanet transits might assume, or you might be able to predict timing wise. This Uranus square the nodes is, I would say, a very long-term transit. It's a huge transit, but it's also so big that it's hard to pin down, because Uranus on its own is very detached. Gemini is data driven. This is not, if you look at it just as Uranus and Gemini. This isn't something that's just the way that our minds are working. Might be glitching out, might be changing, but as I'm saying earlier just now, it's very lucky that we have such a profound emotional situation happening this week, connected to the Uranus in Gemini, because Mercury in Cancer rules Uranus and Gemini. I think that it's the emotional lessons about how we communicate our boundaries, how we communicate our own emotional process. That's where we're noticing that we're not using our minds in the same way at all anymore. And so it might seem, as I'm saying, emotional and personal, but it's like the core teaching here is that we need to use our minds for the Piscean direction and not to hash out old wounds from the past. Okay, so the Piscean direction of using our mind is creating a city with God. I think I talked about that in one of my last videos, where the Pope had written this manifesto, which is basically the exact manifestation of Uranus square the nodes, in my opinion. In any way, he's basically saying we have to build compassionately with others, which is Pisces. Pisces is choosing to use your mind for creativity, for forgiveness, for infinity, and not using your mind for the Virgo South Node, which in the Pope's perspective is recreating the Tower of Babel or whatever, unifying everyone through one technology. Like, we don't want to get more homogenous. We don't want to just keep trying to systematize everything with that South Node in Virgo. We need to do the North Node in Pisces stuff. So the way we're doing that Pisces and Virgo axis is totally changed from here on out. That Pisces Virgo axis on its own is about how we do rituals for the God that we believe in. Pisces being the God we believe in, Virgo being the rituals. Like, how do we actually have a relationship with God? How do we live our lives on a day-to-day, right? In that Virgo way that we feel God's presence, that we invite God's presence, that we engage with God's presence. So because it's so emotional, this week really just makes that shift felt and more present as we are stepping into that brand new lunar cycle next week. A bit more I want to say on diary writing, which is that I've been trying to correlate it further, because what is really happening when I used to journal or diary, which I did, as I said, quite a lot. I realize it's pretty much the same as holding space for yourself or holding space for someone else. So of course I'm like, wow, this week is so much just about holding space. And what does that actually mean, right? When we hold space for ourselves, or when someone is holding space for us, we can share and we can process something that likely happened previously, whether good or bad. This was something important and significant, and we still don't either fully understand it or haven't fully bathed in what it means to us. And so that is to say, it hasn't, even though it's finished, right? The event already happened. It's still quite alive in us and hasn't been dissolved. So we need to do something in order to express it out of us and let it continue flowing with our lives instead of becoming overly identified with it. So it's kind of also similar. I was thinking of this metaphor of like flowers in your kitchen. I often wait until they're dead to throw them out, which is, I don't know. I know people who throw them out immediately when they're about to die. It kind of depends, but I think there's something like nostalgic and longing and romantic about keeping dead flowers, for example. But that's kind of the similar energy of this week, is like, what are you doing with the dead flowers that are sitting on your kitchen table? We are just shifting in how we are expressing our emotional truth. And it's not always that it needs to be private, like a diary or a journal would, we often would consider these things very private, but it's really just to hold something vulnerable, I guess I would say. And so this idea of like there being the final journal entry this week, we're not writing ourselves into a stuck loop anymore where we are rehashing the same story. And again, it just, we get a new way to do it. On Saturday, we start doing it again. On Sunday, the Gemini moon gives us a new way to start writing and a new way to start emotionally processing again. But I think this week is about just holding the space before that new cycle starts. I'm an artist and I'm a huge journaler. So I have so many journals and notebooks and diaries, and they're sitting like in boxes in my parents' basement. And I've looked at how many of them there are, and I'm like, wow, this is almost stupid. I should probably throw everything out. And yet I haven't, because sometimes I think about how, like, and I have studied artists' notebooks and how amazing it is to read them and look at them. And yet it's interesting because it's about scarcity, right? If everything is documented, then nothing is special. But when there's only one singular notebook, then that one feels more significant for whatever reason. And so just bringing that into consideration, because it's not like these are things that we need to hold precious, and yet at the same time, where we're at in our relationship to them as objects, I think can help us to realize we have choice to clear space, to honor space, whichever one you want to do. Another element I want to bring in here is this advice that we get in the spiritual world, which is advice that I would give and that I try to follow myself, which is that we do get to think and choose our own thoughts, right? But then how do we process something difficult? How do we hold space for ourselves while also maintaining that we're thinking the right thoughts? The way that I've actually had experiences this week is like, we don't need to solve the issues we think we need to, because many of the issues are actually non-starters. We like call into question the reason we got stressed about something. Usually for me, it's about like what I said to one person about somebody else. Like for me, it's usually about what's private information. Like I'm not spilling secrets, but I'm very talkative and I say a lot of things, and then I fear if I've said too much or not enough, and so, but then I'm catastrophizing in my head about what if, but none of that stuff has even happened yet, and I've created more problems than actually exist. And so it's my job to return to peace in my brain and not to create stressful diary entries about the potential that isn't even real yet. Does that make sense? So this goes back to Neptune in Aries, which is about committing to the personal truth. And that Neptune in Aries, which is the personal truth, is the ruler of this Pisces moon that is the last quarter square to the sun this week. And ultimately, this new communication. Venus is at the late degrees of Cancer all week, and on Saturday, it moves into Leo, and that's one day before the new moon on Sunday. So this whole week, again, is just emphasizing a big culmination of whatever this Cancer element really is, where we have been holding space for the end of our emotional processing, the diary of our deep expression, our subjective emotional truth, and the way we are expressing that, not because it's true, but because it's what's pouring out of us in that moment. That's what's shifting this week. But the shift is that it's time to move on, but we're not moving on yet. And so we're kind of in this, again, no man's land this week. When Venus moves into Leo, she also begins to oppose Pluto, which is a very grand entrance for Venus into Leo, and it is very different than Venus in Cancer. And so we are about to be far more creative, far more artistic, far more external and joyful about what we love and everything that we have learned in this new way we are using our minds, really just next week. And so I can't emphasize this enough. I'm a broken record, but this week is about holding space for the death of a language. And like we're literally mourning the way we used to make sense of our emotions. And that space, right, the room where we sit and we contemplate our grief is actually that Piscean space. This there's so much that's possible. There's so much possibility and beauty and wisdom and connection to God that is holding that grief that ultimately just wants us to become bigger. As some advice, the easiest way that I like to reorient my brain in this process, because I do write in this different way already, but it's not as normal yet, but I write about what I want. And usually this practice helps us to be in that state of what we enjoy, what we are excited about. I also love to obviously draw and paint, and I think everyone has to become an artist in a way from now on, because my goodness, why wouldn't you just write a new story? And this isn't to spiritually bypass your emotional truth, but it is to choose to reinterpret, which is ultimately that's the Uranus squaring the nodes. Reinterpret through the Piscean lens. Okay? So like go put up a Pinterest board, write a story. Anything that gets your thoughts externalized and you get to see something beautiful, and then it's this type of loop instead of a like this type of loop that's only in your own brain. Okay? So on the Gemini new moon on Sunday, I'm hosting a workshop, holding space. And the idea is we're going to be writing letters to our past selves and our future selves, thanking them for all the space they've held, for us to be where we are right now, accepting the loving truth of the present moment. We will go over that new moon chart together and set some intentions, so it'll be a nice way to kind of bookmark this next month. And then within this workshop, we'll move into that individual writing time. We'll come together, share some highlights, and just kind of spend some time in community. So if you would like to join, that's on the 14th, which is on Sunday. I'm also running another session of astrology for artists at the end of June, which you should check out as well if you make any art or you are excited to just become an artist in this time. We use core rulerships to really understand the deepest motivating factor in our creative process. So would love to see you in either of these workshops. And until next week, have a lovely, lovely life. Okay, bye for now.